Brad, let's begin. Why don't you give us an overview of this new study and talk a little bit about some of the specifics and why it's so important?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with you, and it's exciting to have the Active 3 critical care trial launched. We all have lots of different names for the trials we do, and so it's called Active 3 critical care. Sometimes it's called Active 3B, and sometimes it's called TASECO. Those are all just names for the same thing. It grows out of the Active 3 platform. I'll remind you that Active is the program that's across all of National Institutes of Health that's working to create platform trials, which are more flexible, quicker trials to answer important questions, and it's around COVID, and it was moving in parallel with the vaccine effort. So the US government COVID therapeutics and COVID vaccine efforts launched as Operation Warp Speed, and there was a vaccine focus and a therapeutics focus. Vaccines have done really well, and therapeutics have made some really important strides. But interestingly, there's still more work to be done in the therapeutics question. Therapeutics is just our code word for treatments. So vaccines prevent, treatments treat. And what's complex is that COVID itself, for any one individual, the risk is relatively low unless they have comorbidities. Now, if you infect enough people, even a low risk will lead to substantial death and disability and this long COVID. But on average, the typical person infected with COVID has a nasty cold and gets better. That's on average. And if it were not so transmissible, it wouldn't be that big a deal. But unfortunately, it's very transmissible. So you get huge numbers infected, and then you end up with large numbers of people who get very, very sick. If you can prevent it through the vaccines, perfect. But even with us working at the time of, at the speed of light, essentially, to get these vaccines out and the vaccines being very effective, it's still the case that not everybody's vaccinated yet. And while we work to get control through vaccination, we continue to need treatments. And so far, the broader scientific community has identified a few different treatments. There's an antivirus medicine called remdesivir Veklury that's been shown in people who are in the hospital but not terribly sick, helps them recover faster. There's a steroid medicine that's like prednisone, Decadron, or dexamethasone it's called. Looks like that helps. It looks like there's a rheumatoid arthritis drug called baricitinib that it looks like probably helps, although that is in current discussions to figure that out. So we have had some real successes in terms of identifying therapies, but so far we've been struggling to find therapies that will work for the sickest of the sick, the people who are on life support treatments because their lungs are failing. Historically, we've called that acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS, and it's devastating. It can kill 20 to 40% of the people afflicted by it, and the majority of survivors may take 6 months, 12 months, 5 years to recover from it. And some people, unfortunately, never do get back to their prior state of health. They're, in general, glad to have survived, but they have a new disability that ideally we can find a treatment to limit. So ARDS is primarily the way people die when they get COVID. There are some exceptions. People may get a stroke or some other clot or similar kind of non-lung problem. But fundamentally, the deaths that we're seeing from COVID are from the people who get ARDS. So there's been real hunger to have treatments that might work. And we are fortunate that the overall active group felt that we in Active 3 could be home for this platform trial. We're starting with 2 medicines. One is a hormone that is lung protective that's been known for some years and has been of interest in ARDS generally. And then there's been some evidence from scientists looking at cells, and then from a group doing a clinical trial in a smaller group of patients, looking to see for signals that it might work. And it looks like it has real potential and promise. That's called Aviptadil. It's marketed as Zyasami, named for Sami Saeed, the doctor who discovered it in the 1970s. And it protects the lung cells that are attacked by COVID. It has been demonstrated to decrease the amount of COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2, that's present in cells. It's been shown to adjust the inflammation and immune response, which can be such a big deal in ARDS. And it also helps to prepare more surfactant within the lung. And surfactant is this chemical that basically creates these little soap bubbles in the lung that give it a little bit of extra structure and strength. We all normally have plenty of surfactant. When infants come way too early and they have trouble breathing, it's in large part because they don't have their surfactant yet. So it's an important part of protecting the lung, and Aviptidil has been shown in multiple studies to increase the amount of surfactant. Now, whether it for sure works and gets people recovered faster from the COVID ARDS, we don't know that yet. But we have evidence that suggests substantial promise and a reason to prioritize it. The other thing that we're doing is trying to understand whether remdesivir, this antivirus drug it's marketed as Veklury, whether it's helpful in patients who already have the ARDS, where we have pretty good evidence that it helps people recover faster if they have a more moderate COVID in the hospital, but whether it'll help these critical COVID, the critically ill patients who are requiring life support therapies for their breathing because their lungs are failing, whether it will work in them, we don't know. Again, it's promising, but we really want to know the answer. Does it work or does it not? And it's a collaboration. It's so much of active, and honestly, is so much of the good that's come out of this horrible pandemic this is highly collaborative. It brings together networks based at the University of Minnesota, at Massachusetts General Hospital, at Mount Sinai in New York, in Denmark, in Spain, in Brazil. It's really in Washington, D.C., and at the Veterans Administration. It's these large groups, these big teams that have been working on trials for patients who suffer from serious infections and lung disease for a long time. And we've been able to create these teams that are really working well. So we're very excited. We got 4 patients into the trial so far, and we are moving rapidly. The part of what's so hard about COVID is you want this damn virus to be gone. We want to be done with it. And nothing would make us happier than to never have to do another COVID study for the rest of our lives. The reality, though, is that COVID persists, and while it persists, we feel a moral obligation to bring trial access to patients, to allow them access to these promising drugs in a scientifically careful and safe and appropriate environment, such as you see with a clinical trial, and as quickly as we can to get answers. Now, the reality is, if the vaccines kick in really quickly, like they have in Israel, for example, it's really hard to get answers about COVID if nobody has COVID anymore in a given area. So we're both hoping that COVID goes away so fast we won't get answers, but recognizing that if COVID persists, and it seems like it is persisting at least at different places around the country, that we'll be able to answer the questions as quickly as we can. That's a really wordy and long answer to the question we all have, which is, when will we know for sure whether these drugs work in this patient population? And it depends on how many patients have COVID at the places that we're able to offer the trial to patients. And right now, we have about 50 sites in the United States and probably another 30 or 40 sites across the world outside the United States that are at various stages of opening up for the trial. We're currently enrolling at, I think we're at 6 sites right now. It updates every day. Everything's so fast-paced in the age of COVID. But I think we're at about 6 sites already open and have the medications available for patients in trials. And then we have another about 6 or 7 that are within a week or so of launch. We're going to spend the first few weeks enrolling 40 patients at a core group of about a dozen sites, making sure everything looks good, the trial protocol is working as expected and planned. And then we'll expand it out to the full range of, again, somewhere in the range of about 80 sites. And it's a really collaborative and open group. And we have found that multiple hospitals have reached out and said, hey, could we join? And our answer so far has always been yes. Anybody who can run a trial at the level that's required, we're eager to be collaborative, and we have mechanisms to bring hospitals into the group. Here in Utah, my beloved home state, the University of Utah Hospital and Intermountain Medical Center are the locations where we have this trial open. And in fact, 3 of the 4 first patients that have been enrolled here in Utah.
Question.
And I think, Jess, that was my sense of kind of an intro.
Perfect. Thank you. No, that was great. Let's take a step back and very simply explain the process when somebody has COVID and how it escalates to acute respiratory distress syndrome. What's that process like that occurs to make these patients so sick that they're in that window of ARDS?
Thanks, Jess. It's a complicated story, and anytime you simplify something, you introduce a certain amount of untruth. So be mindful that the full story is quite complex, but I'll simplify it in the interest of being useful. In general, what happens is for most patients, COVID infects the passages in the nose and mouth, gives you a nasty cold, you feel like crud, your immune system kicks in pretty early, wipes out the virus, and you go about your life. It was not that big a deal. That's in most people, particularly in young people that don't have any medical problems. Bear in mind, though, that the medical problems we're talking about are having a little bit of extra weight. Not that much extra weight, not a person that you would think of as having terrible morbid obesity, but just somebody who's just a bit big. That would be a medical problem that COVID, the virus SARS-CoV-2, notoriously exploits. But in general, for a person who's otherwise medically quite stable, no big deals, no problems, infects the nose and the back of the mouth, your immune system kicks in hard, gets rid of it, you're fine. In an unhappy subset, the virus will jump down into the lungs, and there it attacks the lungs cells that line the airways. Those are called epithelial cells or alveolar epithelial cells. And what it does is it both creates a lot more virus that then causes more severe infection. And unfortunately, in many patients, the immune system was a little bit late to the party, but then cracked down really hard. And instead of doing a sort of surgical strike to eliminate the virus, it sort of just drops a big bomb. Sorry to use a military conflict, but it does feel like we're at war with this virus, a military metaphor, but it does feel like we're at war with this virus. So when the immune system sort of scattershots and drops a bomb to take out one assassin, there's a lot of collateral damage, and that collateral damage is in the lung. And that then, the thing to bear in mind about the lung is it's basically a very light, it's a very light foam. Even though you feel like the lung is quite solid, if you touch it, it feels almost like a very light, like whipped cream almost. Not a lot of substance to it. It's so delicate, and it has to be delicate because it has to bring in all the oxygen you need and get rid of all the carbon dioxide that you need to get rid of. And it has to be able to do that with a huge surface area. And the way it does that is to have really tiny, thin walls. When you drop a bomb in that, all of a sudden, instead of air and tiny, thin walls, you have mucus and dead cells and blood clots and water and pus and inflammation. And you can't breathe through that. You can't breathe through that. It's like drowning. And many patients describe the experience of this terrible infection in the lung as suffocating and like drowning. And the way we prevent early death from this is to put people on breathing machines of various descriptions that provide high pressures that allow you to push some of that debris out of the lung so that air can circulate again. It's very scary though, and it doesn't always work. Early in the pandemic, everybody said, oh, if you get intubated, if you end up on the life support systems for COVID, you're as good as dead. You wouldn't even want to bother. And that's not accurate. That's not accurate. The majority of patients do survive, even when they get through ARDS. But it's not an overwhelming majority. 60%, 70% will survive once they get to that point. But we're really mindful both of the disabilities they may encounter afterwards, trying to improve those, and of the fact that, again, 20 to 40% of patients with this ARDS will die. The live question that's still being worked out in various studies is how much ongoing replication of the virus or ongoing sort of breeding of the virus in the lungs is contributing to the problem versus it mostly being the immune system. And that's one reason we like the two drugs that we're starting with, because they attend to the virus, and there's also, for Aviptidil particularly, this effect on the strength and the integrity of the lung and on the immune system over response.
Okay, question from Sean Means at the Salt Lake Tribune. Is there a timeline to when the results from this trial will be seen by the public, and how soon until the results translate to a treatment that is given to patients?
It's a great question, and that's what in my wordy thing about hoping this stupid virus will go away and also being prepared to offer these trials to patients if they get infected. That's what I was working at answering. It really depends on how much COVID we have over the next few months. If we have large amounts of COVID in the hospitals and large numbers of patients in need of this trial, we'll be able to answer the question quickly. If, however, it moves to a kind of smolder, the way the H1N1 was, then it will take us longer. So if things move incredibly quickly, we may have answers in 4 or 5 months. If things move slower, it may be that we get answers more slowly. In terms of the translation of evidence into available treatments, that the basic process there is you complete the study, you answer the question, and then you bring the results to the regulatory bodies who are really doing fantastic work day and night and have been through the entire pandemic. They weigh not only the results from your trial, but the results from other trials, the full spectrum of evidence. They consult with their groups of experts, the advisory committees, they call them, and then they'll make a determination whether an emergency use authorization would be allowed. And that's how, so far, the vast majority of medications have become available to treat patients with COVID is through either emergency use authorizations, or in the case of dexamethasone, it's just an easily available drug. If we get good evidence from remdesivir in this trial, that drug's already approved. So that, if we get good results from the remdesivir side in this patient population, that could be just immediate. It's an already approved drug. We're just finding out for sure whether it works in this subgroup, the sickest subgroup of people who have serious COVID. In terms of Aviptidil, because it's not currently approved in the United States, it would require going through the EUA. And as I've watched, it seems like the FDA is very responsive. If there's good, strong evidence, they move very quickly. And just look at how quickly they've been able to do, A, a very thorough job with vetting the vaccines, and B, able to get the vaccines out and available.
Okay, follow-up question from Sean. Is it difficult to study these drugs on very sick patients? If the drugs don't work or do more harm than good, how do you know whether a patient's death is attributable to the drug or from the virus?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And it's one that we and the regulators wrestle with all the time. The simple answer is the way we do it is a process called randomized controls. Randomized controls. And what that means is that for a promising new drug that's not available within a trial, outside the drug, there's a 0% access to the drug. Inside the trial, it increases to 50% probability of receiving the drug. And half the patients will receive the active drug, half the patients receive the placebo, which is equivalent to not having been in the trial in the first place, where you would not have had access to the drug. And that happens at random, that we use a computer, and none of us knows. Clearly, there are some pharmacists and some what are called unblinded statisticians who do know the assignments, but those assignments are not shared with any of the investigators that are, physician researchers that are performing the study, any of the research staff, the patients, or the families. And then the advantage, the power of this is, if you look at the two groups, one group got the active treatment, one group got the innocuous placebo control, and then you look to see, do they look different? And the way you measure whether they're different is something called endpoints or outcomes. They're metrics to define whether a medicine has worked or not. And then we do extensive statistical analyses comparing the two groups along these various metrics of how they're doing. We also have a very rigorous process of keeping track of what might be reactions to the drug, and those are called adverse events. That's just the lingo that's used in the regulatory bodies. But those adverse events are us looking very carefully. Oh, did somebody get a rash? Oh, did somebody have a cough, etc. So it's that process, the placebo control and the careful watching of these possible reactions. That honestly, it's been the system that's worked really well for the past 50 years. There are always improvements that could be made, but this really has been the way we both get access to trials to patients right away, and we get answers that will matter for all the rest of us who get sick in the future as a result of the trial.
Question from Lisa Riley-Roche at the Deseret News. What other drugs have been tested on these patients, and which ones, and what were the results? Oh, excuse me. Have other drugs been tested on these patients in this subset, and which ones, and what were the results of those?
That's a great question. One of the things that we're discovering as we bring into creation what's called a public-private partnership, where you have people like me that are physician scientists that don't work for companies. We work for, in my case, I'm employed by Intermountain Healthcare, and I'm a professor at the University of Utah. So that's the public part, and the government then, through National Institutes of Health and Department of Defense and other sources, provides funding for it. So that's the public phase. And then there's the private side, which is the traditional pharmaceutical companies. What we're finding in the public-private partnerships is that there are a lot of people who care about what's going on with the companies. That's that sort of stock market stuff. And as a consequence, we have to be very tight-lipped about what we see and don't see, because we want to avoid problems with insider trading and et cetera, et cetera. I can assure you that when there's solid evidence that something works, that gets released right away. When there's that earlier evidence where it's not really clear, then we as the academics don't talk about those, because ultimately we need to be mindful of those potential conflicts and concerns. So far, there is a suggestion that in these patients, dexamethasone, that simple steroid, works pretty well. And that's come from several different sources, most prominently actually England's recovery trial. So we've got evidence there. And then most of the other evidence is what's called from subgroups. So you enroll in a trial everybody in the hospital with COVID, and then you keep track of who's only moderately sick, who's severe, and who's critical. And then when you look at the critical group, that's just a small subset of the overall trial. And the trick there with that small subset is that it gives suggestive evidence, suggestions of promise, but it doesn't provide definitive evidence of benefit. And that's the complexity that we're working in. So there's some suggestive evidence for a small handful of immune modifying medications. And baricitinib, for example, there's a press release. We don't have the full data yet, but there's a press release from a trial called Cove Barrier that suggests the possibility that there's some promise in this patient group. But again, it looks like this is probably going to be a subset of the patients where, again, we get a suggestion that it's going to benefit, and we're hoping that it's going to benefit, but not something we can really be entirely confident of. So at this point, good suggestion that dexamethasone helps. Maybe some early data that baricitinib helps, but we need more information to answer it. And as a consequence, there really is a substantial unmet need. There are some other promising candidates. Those are working through the system, but my memory of the promising candidates I've seen are that they're still early enough and the data is not clear enough that they're not yet publicly shared as part of this process. But there's no conspiracy of silence. It's just trying to move possible agents through the process to get them to the point where we have real evidence, strong evidence, rather than just hints of promise.
A question from Sydney Glenn and Lisa Riley Roche. I think we answered your question about all the entities that have been involved. If you still have a question about that, it hasn't been answered, let us know. But Sydney Glenn from Fox 13 News asks, what goes into determining who's eligible for the trial, and how can people get into it here in Utah? You want to discuss that?
Yeah, that's a great point. We try to think as scientists, who are the patients most likely to benefit from a medication? And to do that, we review, how did the medication work in cells? How did the medication work in animals, in the animal testing that's done to know whether something's safe to bring to humans? What do we know about the basic biology of it? And then what are the different things that happen to different groups of patients where we might intervene? That then leads you, after careful deliberation with other scientists, to the definition of what we call a target population, And that's the group that we think is most likely to benefit from the medicine if it works. The definition of the target population that gets put into the study protocol. And the study protocols are very explicit. And if medicine looks like it really works, those target population definitions, that's what ends up going on to, that like 35 pages of fine print that falls out of a medicine bottle when you open it. That's the label or the package insert. And that defines who it's been proved to work in. the target populations we define for the trials are what then goes into the label or the package insert that is used to tell you when to use the medication. In terms of being eligible for it, we currently have only been able to launch it. It takes a fair bit of experience and staffing. We've only been able to launch it at the University of Utah Hospital and at Intermountain Medical Center currently. If a patient is at University of Utah or Hospital or Intermountain Medical Center and the family members feel like they have a requirement for life support, then I would recommend just asking your treating doctor, hey, can we get them into the TSECO trial? And then an evaluation will be made by the study teams to make sure that they fit within that target population. And then if so, the study will be offered to them. And then you sign a consent form, make sure that you know what's involved in the study, and then would join it. So crucially, they have to be eligible. There are certain conditions that make it impossible to take Aviptidil. For example, Aviptidil is not allowed in pregnancy, and it's not allowed if you have really bad liver failure, for example. But in general, we are game, and we and the study teams love to take the calls of people interested in the trial that we can try to bring the trial to them.
Another question from Sean Means. He says, there were headlines yesterday and today about a possible treatment from Pfizer, a take-it-home pill. Just to clarify, this has nothing to do with that, correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And I think most of those, just bear in mind that most of the press releases tend to be the early suggestive stuff rather than the definitive, yes, it definitely works. But I am aware that Pfizer has been working on a drug, and this is not that.
And then one last question, unless we have any others from participating media. Intermountain has a long history with ARDS, actually pioneered a lot of treatment. Is that in large part because of resulting in your role and our role of Intermountain with our knowledge base of ARDS and our treatment pioneering protocols?
Yeah, thanks. I think sometimes people forget that Intermountain actually has an academic core. When Intermountain was created as a gift from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to the communities of the Intermountain West, by turning over what was then a church-run hospital system to the community. When that happened back in the early to mid-1970s, at the very beginning, there were actually physician scientists who were based at LDS Hospital then. About 10 years ago, I lose track, time was fast, but I think about 10 years ago, Intermountain Medical Center then became our core academic flagship hospital. And we moved a core group of physician scientists who've always been at Intermountain over there. And that group really for 40 years has been doing cutting edge research in ARDS. And most of us are faculty at the University of Utah as well. Intermountain also has its own academic and research wing that is really quite strong. And as a consequence, we've been in at the ground floor on really the premier United States critical care or ICU clinical trials group was called ARDSNet, then called PEDAL. And we've been in it since the beginning, and it's been just a wonderful ongoing collaborative relationship. And when COVID came, we took our infrastructure, which had been focused on ARDS and its causes for 40 years, and through PEDAL, we said we're ready to heed the call. And it's an all hands on deck situation. And I think people around the country realize and recognize that Intermountain draws together really great, smart people, really accomplished research teams, our coordinators and pharmacists and regulatory liaisons and managers are all top notch and have really strong experience. I think sometimes people think we're a bunch of Highlanders off in the mountains somewhere between the coasts, and we are, and that's cool. But in addition, we've got a lot of really bright, hardworking people who are operating at the highest levels. And fundamentally, it was through Intermountain being ready and well prepared by the decades of experience and our pre-existing relationships with these wonderful networks across the country and increasingly across the world that allowed us to then pitch in this very specific area in a way that I think really does great honor to our state and to Intermountain and the University of Utah, and that is really good for patients. It's really a privilege and an honor to be able to participate with the local teams, the national teams, and the global teams. We really are in this together. This has been a bleak year and change for all of us, but there have been these little rays of light, and these collaborations and the honoring our legacy here have really been some of those rays of light.
Well, thank you, Dr. Brown. I don't see any other questions in our chat box. We will be sending out a recording of this press briefing along with a full news release with details on the study. So if you do have additional questions after that release, please let us know. But we do appreciate you joining us today, and look for that link and full news release coming in here within the next half hour. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Brown. Congratulations on your work, and we wish you good luck, and thank you for taking time to join us today.
Thanks. Be well. Get vaccinated.